And good morning. Welcome to Courageous Path to Freedom Vacation Bible School, day number 2. Today we're going to talk about how we should be using our abilities for God and be willing to try new tasks, new things when God asks us to. A lot of times when I'm recruiting people to help out in things like Vacation Bible School or an Easter program or Sunday school or something like that, I'll ask somebody, and very often I'll hear people say, I don't think I have the ability to do that, or I don't think I know enough to do that. Well, God wants us to try doing new things. Doesn't matter whether we're an adult, a teenager, or even a child. There are things that we can do for God, and we should be willing to try a new task. We're looking at 2 characters in the Bible as our feature character stories for Courageous. One of the people we're looking at is Joseph, the boy who had the coat of many colors, who was sold by his older brothers into slavery. We looked at that in yesterday's session. That covered Genesis chapter 37, and it also covered chapters 39 and 40. Today we'll be covering chapters 41 and 42 of Genesis, and also we're going to be looking in Exodus at the life of Moses, because Joseph was the first of the Hebrew people to go down into Egypt. God sent him to a foreign land, and he had a difficult time for a while, but God was working out his plan in Joseph's life, and Joseph is willing to trust God even when circumstances seem bleak, even when he doesn't understand what the future holds. We can learn a lot from Joseph. We're also looking at Moses, who lived some 400 years after Joseph's time. Moses was spared as a baby from being put to death by Pharaoh's orders. Pharaoh's own daughter adopted Moses into her family, and he was raised as an Egyptian. But as an adult, when trying to break up a disturbance between 2 people, Moses accidentally did great harm to another person, and he had to flee for his life to another country where he had to start life all over again. He only had the clothes on his back, and he had to leave immediately and learn to live in a new occupation, something he'd never had to do before, be a shepherd. God had a plan for Moses' life too. God got Moses' attention. Moses did not want to do what God wanted him to do at first, but God was able to talk him into it. So part of today's lesson will also cover Exodus chapters 7 through 12. So I would encourage the moms and dads or teenagers, anybody that's old enough to read, to go and read those passages and then play with your family. I've got several objects here we're going to use today that I bought. Some of them are pretty inexpensive. You could get them yourself, or you could come up with some ideas of your own. So let's look first at the story of Joseph. Joseph, once he was made a slave in Egypt, he became a very, very successful, trusted servant. Any task he was given, he tried to do his best at it. But Joseph wound up being falsely accused of a crime he didn't commit, and he wound up going to jail. So I'm going to let these keys that look kind of like jail cell keys represent Joseph's time in prison. You may want to whip out some keys to show what do you do with keys? You lock things to prevent people who shouldn't be getting at them from getting at them. You unlock for the right people to get at them. Maybe you've got a skeleton key of some kind around your house, or maybe you've just got a regular set of keys. This can represent Joseph being in prison. While he's in prison, and again, he hadn't done anything wrong, but he was charged and made guilty of a crime he didn't do. Instead of getting mad at God, Joseph continued to pray to God. He continued to try to do his best, even in the prison. One day, 2 more prisoners were added to the prison. These 2 prisoners happened to be very high-ranking servants of Pharaoh, and Pharaoh had them put in prison. One of them was a baker, the man who prepared Pharaoh's food. So I'm going to let this piece of loaf of bread represent the baker. The baker is in prison. The other fellow who was in prison was the cupbearer, and I'm going to let this cup, any cup you have will do, represent the cupbearer. The cupbearer's job was to inspect all the food that was prepared for Pharaoh and to taste it to make sure that nobody had tried to put in anything into the food that might make Pharaoh sick or possibly kill him, that there was no poison or any harm that would be there. So the baker preparing Pharaoh's food and the cupbearer were men who used to hold very high jobs, men that Pharaoh trusted. And somehow they got in trouble with Pharaoh, and he had them put in prison, where Joseph, who by now was one of the trustee prisoners, was helping take care of them. One night, the baker had a dream, and it was a dream that when he woke up, he remembered what it was, and it puzzled him. It didn't seem to make any sense to him. He told his dream to Joseph. Joseph used the abilities that God had given him to understand dreams to tell the cupbearer what his dream meant. He told the cupbearer, your dream represents the fact that in 3 days, Pharaoh is going to get you out of prison, and he's going to restore you to your old job. Well, that was good news for the cupbearer. When Joseph told the cupbearer what his dream meant, he made sure that the cupbearer knew that the only reason Joseph understood the dream is because God had given him that ability. He gave credit to God for it. He asked the cupbearer to do one thing when he got his job back. He said, when you get your job back, remember me to Pharaoh. I'm here in prison. I have been falsely accused. Tell Pharaoh about me. And the cupbearer promised to do it. Well, because the baker heard that Joseph had given a good interpretation to the cupbearer, the baker went to Joseph and he said, I had a dream too, and I don't know what it means. And the baker told Joseph about his dream, about preparing foods, baking like he would normally do, and how birds came and plucked the food and ate it and consumed it away. And Joseph told the baker what his dream meant, and again he gave credit to God, but the interpretation for the baker was that he was the one who was going to be guilty, and Pharaoh was going to have the baker executed for his crime in just a few days. Both dreams came true. The baker was executed, and the cupbearer was found to be innocent and carried back to Pharaoh and given his old job back. The cupbearer had promised that he would tell Pharaoh about Joseph, but he forgot when he got his job back. And the scripture account in chapters 40 and 41 is going to tell us that 2 whole years passed. Cupbearers forgot all about Joseph. Joseph's still in prison waiting. And then Pharaoh had 2 dreams. And Pharaoh woke up from his dreams, and he remembered what his dreams were. And the dreams puzzled him. They didn't make any sense. And the cupbearer remembered then, oh, I remember when I was in the prison, Joseph was able to interpret the dream for me. But then the cupbearer thought, uh-oh, wait a minute. Do I really want to tell the Pharaoh about Joseph? Because if I tell the Pharaoh about Joseph, it might remind Pharaoh of when he had me put in prison, and I don't want to get in any trouble with Pharaoh. But he decided to do the right thing because he had promised Joseph. And so the cupbearer tells Pharaoh, and they send for Joseph out of the prison, and Joseph tells Pharaoh what his dreams meant. That his dreams meant, the first dream meant that there was going to be 7 years when Egypt would enjoy very good weather, very good crops, and they would have a terrific year of being able to produce food. But those 7 years were going to be followed by the 7 years in Pharaoh's second dream, where there would be a severe famine, a severe drought, and there wouldn't be any food. And so Joseph made sure he gave God credit again. He told Pharaoh, God let you know this so that you can take action now. During these 7 good years that are coming, Pharaoh, you should set aside some stuff and prepare so that you'll have enough food to take care of your people when times are bad. Kind of like in our day and time, where we live here in southern Alabama, we just have entered hurricane season. And so all the TV news reports and the radios are encouraging people to get an emergency kit together in case there's a bad storm and people need to have medicines or have emergency foods, have some extra money on hand in case they have to evacuate, make a plan for their pets, to get prepared so that if something bad happens, you're ready for it. Well, that's what Joseph was doing. He was telling Pharaoh, get the people prepared. Pharaoh listened to what Joseph said, and he decided that was such good advice, he made Joseph the number 2 man in all of Egypt. Joseph's not a slave anymore. Joseph's not a prisoner anymore. Now Joseph is in charge of Egypt. Could Joseph have used his position to be mean to the people who had falsely accused him of a crime that put him in jail in the first place? Could he be mean to the people who, when he was a slave, mistreated him? He could have chosen to do that. But Joseph knew that God loves everybody, that God wants people to forgive when people do wrong, that God wants us to act like God, to treat people the way God would treat them, to show kindness, to show mercy. So Joseph set aside enough food to be able to take care of the people in Egypt and people from other countries who were going to come looking for food. We're going to learn more about that part of the story in tomorrow's session of VBS. Now let's turn to our second Bible story hero of courageous path to freedom, and that's Moses. Moses, as we learned yesterday, was raised up as a prince of Egypt and accidentally harmed a man and had to flee the country. Now it's 40 years later. He's been living as a shepherd all this time. He has finally encountered God on Mount Sinai, and God has told him, Moses, I want you to do something for me. I want you to be the one to go to Egypt to tell Pharaoh, let my people go. And Moses was very reluctant to do so. In Exodus chapter 3, he sees God in the burning bush, and for the next couple of chapters, you'll see Moses trying to give God excuses on why I can't do it. God, please send somebody else. But God had chosen Moses, and God had given Moses the ability to lead. God's got plans for you. Doesn't matter how young or old you are, whether you're a boy or a girl, whether you're rich or poor, God's got plans for you. All you have to do is to be willing to use the abilities that God has given you for His glory, and to be willing to try a new task when God asks you to try a new task. You see, I've got a lot of objects here on the table because one of the things that Moses is going to be called to do is to go back and talk to Pharaoh and tell him, let my people go. And Pharaoh will refuse several times, and God will try to get Pharaoh's attention. Exodus chapters 7 through 12 list 10 separate times that Moses went to Pharaoh, gave him God's message, and said, Pharaoh, God says, this is what you're supposed to do. Let my people go, and if you don't, this is what's going to happen. Pharaoh refused. The first time Pharaoh refused, Moses took his staff here, and I've got this staff. This staff I got on a trip to the Bahamas. There are some very talented wood carvers there. I watched them make this staff. they would just take a stick of wood that they had polished, and it was just a curved stick, and they would take a machete, and I watched the men make this artwork that kind of looks like a snake here on a pole, and it looks like a snake skin for a while here. Moses found a large limb, a stick that he would use as his staff to walk on. It was a custom in that day for people to have walking sticks, and they would carve them up and put unique markings so that everybody knew which stick belonged to which person. Moses was going to take his staff and go and confront Pharaoh, and before God allowed any of the plagues to happen, God allowed Pharaoh to see. Moses had Aaron lay the stick down, and it turned into a live snake. Pharaoh had magicians who were able to turn their sticks into snake too. Sometimes the devil will try to do things that will imitate what God does. But Moses' snake swallowed up the other two, and then Moses picks it back up and it turns into the stick again. So I watched some very talented carvers carve this out, and I bought it because I wanted to use it for teaching Bible. Those of you who've been in Bible school out at the chapel, if you were part of the Dan tribe, the tribal symbol for Dan is a snake, and we use this pole a lot as the Dan tribe's symbol. Pharaoh saw what happened with Moses' staff turning into a snake. He didn't want to trust God. So God used plagues to get his attention. I bought it's called a sack of plagues. You can get it online at Judaica stores. I've got one. We got one for Miss Anita to use in the children's ministry. And so these little stuffed plush toys here that we use when we're doing Passover and when we're teaching the story of the Exodus of the kids, we use this sack of plagues. But you can also get from a lot of vendors at discount stores things called a bag of plagues, or from vendors where you can make these little masks. This one represents the blood. The first plague that hit the Egyptians was their water turned blood red. It killed off the animals that were in the water, so the frogs came ashore and started bringing diseases to people. Animals started to die, and that produced flies and lice. Then the cattle started getting sick. Then the wild beasts that lived out in the wild, not the domestic animals, started coming in looking for food, scavenging on the carcasses. Then people broke out in a disease called boils, where very painful sores would rise up on folks. Then hail started to fall out of the sky and cause damage. Then plagues of locusts came through. Then there was darkness over Egypt for 3 whole days. No sunshine, just total eclipse-like darkness conditions. And then finally, the death of the firstborn. In between each and every one of these plagues, Moses went to Pharaoh and he told him, Pharaoh, God said, let my people go. And if you don't, this is what's going to happen. Pharaoh experienced the plague, but he wouldn't let the people go. Moses would go to him again. Pharaoh, God says, let my people go. If you don't, this is going to happen to you. Pharaoh wouldn't listen. 10 times, Pharaoh would not listen. When the final plague happened, the death of the firstborn, even Pharaoh's own son died that night. God spared the Hebrew people, but all the firstborn of Egypt suffered because Pharaoh would not listen to God. Moses had to be willing to go back to Egypt, to go and tell Pharaoh, this is what God said, and to trust that God would make good on everything, that God would turn the water into blood, that God would cause the frogs to do the damage that they did, that he would cause the flies and the lice to do the damage, that he would cause the cattle disease that he would cause the wild beasts to come, the boils, the hail, the locust. If you've got some rubber plastic animals, or you can get things like that at the Dollar Tree store, you could probably make or draw, maybe design your own set of plagues. Maybe get some construction paper and some string or some yarn and make your own plague mask. We're going to have a lady come out and show you how to make some simple crafts. And this will be one of the crafts that we'll suggest that people learn how to make your own mask using construction paper or some foam figurines, that sort of thing. Darkness, death of the firstborn. Moses had to be willing to trust that God would make everything that he said was going to happen. Joseph had to trust that whether God got him out of that prison or not, he would continue to worship God. When God did get him out of the prison and raised him up into a position of power, Joseph didn't let his power go to his head. Joseph continued to have the same character, the same trust in God. He continued to be kind to people, even when people had mistreated him. That's the way God wants you and me to live. Tomorrow we're going to learn about forgiving others, and obeying God is the way for us to live and be free. Because see, if you're hanging on to anger, if you're hanging on to the hurts that somebody did you wrong in the past, you'll never really be happy or be at peace about it. You'll always dwell on the anger. The way to become courageous is to recognize that God is with you all the time, when things are good, when they're bad. To recognize that God's given you some kind of ability. May not be the same ability that I have, that's okay. But God's given you some kind of ability, and he wants you to use it for him. And to recognize that when God asks you to do something, even if it seems very strange and different, something you've never tried before, trust God for the outcome. We'll see you tomorrow for session number 3. Today we're in Genesis chapter 40. Joseph, whom we learned about yesterday, has been sold as a slave into Egypt. For a while, he served in a man named Potiphar's house. Potiphar was one of the Egyptian officials, and even though he was now a slave, and Potiphar had changed Joseph's name from Joseph to an Egyptian name, Zaphenath-Paneah. That's a hard name to say, so we'll say that one again. Joseph is also known as Zaphenath-Paneah. The more task that Potiphar gave Joseph, the weller Joseph did. He continued to do the very best he could, every task he was given with. Even though he's gone through some difficult times, he's been taken away from his family. His own family rejected him. They're the ones who sold him into slavery. Now he's living in a foreign country. He has no idea when or if he'll ever see his family again. And instead of getting bitter and mad at God or mad at his family over what's happened to him, Joseph is trying to make the best of a bad situation. So anything Potiphar asked him to do, he does his very best all the time. And Potiphar gets to where he trusts him more and more, and he puts him in charge of everything in his household. One day, Potiphar's wife decided that she wanted Joseph to pay attention to her and to show her affection, even though she's married to somebody else. Joseph knew he couldn't do that. So he refused, and he tried to avoid situations where he would be alone with Potiphar's wife, just so he wouldn't be tempted and so that she couldn't tempt him to do something wrong. After a while, she got mad and she falsely accused him of doing something that he didn't do. And she told her husband about it. And he got angry at Joseph and put Joseph into prison. Now things were really bad for Joseph But even in the prison, Joseph decided, I'm still going to try to be the best man I can be. I'm going to try to serve God and do the right thing no matter what happens to me. Joseph is in prison for quite a while, and after a while, 2 servants of Pharaoh, the leader of the entire country of Egypt, were put into the prison because Pharaoh was angry and he couldn't figure out which of these 2 men had done him wrong. One of the men was Pharaoh's cupbearer. I've got a little prop here. This is a cup that we use for the Passover ceremony, for the Last Supper. Any cup that you have at the house would do as a prop for this. The cupbearer was an important, trusted official to Pharaoh and to any foreign king. Sometimes people would try to poison the king. So the king would make sure that this trusted servant, the cupbearer, would taste the food and taste whatever drink was going to be given to the king before the king tasted it. If the cupbearer didn't get sick, then it was okay for the king to take it. And so Pharaoh had a cupbearer. The cupbearer is one of the 2 men that's in prison. I've also got here some baked bread. This is a fresh biscuit from today. The baker also was in prison because Pharaoh didn't know which of the 2 had done him wrong, so he put them both in jail until he could try to figure it out. Joseph had risen to a position, even in the prison, to where he was a trustee. And so he was helping take care of the baker and the cupbearer. And one night, the cupbearer had a dream. And he woke up from the dream and it bothered him. He didn't know what the dream meant. He mentioned it to Joseph, and Joseph told him there is a God who understands all things, and he gave him God's interpretation of the dream. Joseph had a special gift from God about being able to understand and interpret the meanings of dreams. So he told the cupbearer what the dream meant, that within 3 days he would be taken out of the prison and would be given his job back. When the baker heard that Joseph could tell the cupbearer what his dream was, the baker went and asked Joseph, well, I had a dream too. And he told him his dream, and he asked Joseph, what does this mean? And Joseph told him, the dream that you had about the bread being baked and the birds coming and eat it means that in 3 days, Pharaoh is going to come and have you put to death. Well, that wasn't a good interpretation as far as the baker was concerned, but it was the truth. Sure enough, 3 days later, what Joseph told the baker came true, and what he told the cupbearer came true. As the cupbearer was being released from prison and restored back to his job, Joseph asked him to do one thing for him. I've interpreted your dream for you. I've told you what it meant. When you get your job back, remember me to Pharaoh, because I'm here in the prison and I haven't done anything wrong. And the cupbearer promised Joseph that he would do it. But we read here in Genesis chapter 40 that the cupbearer, as soon as he got restored back to his job, he forgot all about Joseph. And for 2 years, it didn't even cross his mind. Then the time came when Pharaoh himself had a troubling dream almost 2 whole years later. And when Pharaoh was troubled by his dream and he was telling everybody that worked for him what the dream was and how it puzzled him, then the cupbearer remembered. And he was a little bit afraid to remind Pharaoh that he had ever been in the prison. But he kept his word to Joseph, and he reminded Pharaoh, a couple of years ago, when you got mad at me and put me in prison, there was a fellow there who was able to interpret my dreams and the baker's dreams. And if you ask him, he can probably interpret your dream too. The cupbearer had to risk reminding Pharaoh of a time when Pharaoh was mad at him. You and I may have times when we've done something to displease our parents or a teacher or somebody, And we don't necessarily want to remind them of a time when we did something that we shouldn't. But he had made a promise to Joseph, and he was going to keep his word. So he reminded Pharaoh, and Pharaoh wasn't mad at him. Pharaoh was more interested in getting the answer to his dream. So Pharaoh sends for Joseph, tells Joseph what his dream was, and Joseph tells him, Pharaoh, God has revealed to you what he's about to do. There are going to be 7 years when we're going to have an abundance of crops, all the food we could eat, all the rain we need to make the crops grow. But after that, there's going to be 7 years of famine. And so what you need to do, Pharaoh, is you need to make sure that while times are good, while there's plenty of food, that you select somebody to take charge of all the grain of Egypt and set some aside. Have like a savings place for food to be stored so that when the drought comes and the food isn't available, that people can still eat. And Pharaoh thought it was wonderful advice. And he decided, well, who could I put in charge of taking care of this business for me? Who would be better than this man who is able to tell me the dream? So Joseph is now no longer a slave in Egypt. He's no longer a prisoner of Egypt. Joseph has been raised to a position of authority. I have these two staffs here that a lot of times ancient rulers would have a staff to show that they are in charge. Pharaoh had such a staff, and Pharaoh gave Joseph authority to be the number 2 guy in all of Egypt, to where everybody in the country except for Pharaoh would have to take orders and instructions from Joseph. Joseph was going to be the leader. And Joseph led well. He did everything he told Pharaoh he would do. They set aside some of the grain every year for 7 years so that they had enough food stored up in reserve. And then when there was a time when they couldn't grow crops, people didn't starve. They were able to feed everybody in Egypt. And the famine was so severe that even people in other countries were starting to come to Egypt because they heard that there was food in Egypt. Tomorrow we're going to talk a little bit more about some people who came to visit Joseph when he's now in power in Egypt, and how Joseph is going to show kindness and mercy and forgiveness to people who had done him wrong. We'll see you tomorrow for more of Courageous Path to Freedom.
Good morning, boys and girls and families. We're here again to talk about some science from Egypt. And in Egypt, they were the first people to create a thing called the sickle. Now, this is my mother's sickle from the 1950s, and we used to use that to cut weeds with, but they developed a sickle, and some of them were bigger than this, and they would use that to cut their crops down. And so they were among the first to create the sickle. One of their other inventions was an easier way to dip water out of the river, or the Nile River, or different ponds that they may have had. They made a shadoof. And this is a picture of what one might look like. And they would have a bag over here to dip in, and a weight back here, and then they could dip that down. Water's heavy. I mean, it weighs 9-10 pounds a gallon, whatever. And so they would dip water that way. And I made one. You can make one at home. I got 3 sticks here that I just got fell out of a tree, tied them together, and then you take another stick, and I stole from my wife's kitchen a little bucket there that she keeps stuff in, and you got to put that there, put it through these sticks. Then you're going to have a rock on the end to weight it. Then you tie it together so that the bar doesn't come off, and now you can dip water. I'll put that over the table. You can dip water, and it's not so heavy. Okay. One of the children we had up here asked the question, is that the only reason they did it, because it was heavy? No, there was crocodiles in the river, and so you want to save from getting eaten by a crocodile by getting water. The last thing we'll talk about today is how they made paper. This is a papyrus plant, and they would cut these plants and cut strips in them, And then they would lay them crosswise to each other and let them dry out. And then they would make paper for which they could write on. Now they did a lot of writing in stone. And we're using the hieroglyphics we talked about yesterday. But they also had paper. And they would use that to keep records, etc. So that's what we have today. See you again tomorrow.
After interpreting dreams for the baker and the cupbearer, Joseph stayed in prison for 2 full years. During those years, it's possible that Joseph questioned God's faithfulness or cried out for reassurance of God's presence. Or maybe he maintained a rock-solid trust in God. The Bible doesn't tell us, but we imagine that it was a dark, faith-stretching time. Help me out, and I'll tell you Pharaoh's dreams. Pharaoh's first dream was about cows. There were 7 big, healthy, fat cows. Now, I don't know about you, but here in Egypt, cows make this loud mooing sound. Boys and girls, can you make a mooing sound?
Mm.
The healthy cows came up out of the Nile River and started eating the grass. Now, can you graze on the grass? How do you think the cows grazed on the grass? Then 7 skinny, scrawny, pathetic, sickly-looking cows came up out of the Nile. These were the worst-looking cows Pharaoh had ever seen. They mooed very sadly. Boys and girls, can you give me a sad moo? The healthy cows mooed, and the sickly cows mooed. Now, can we do that together? The healthy cows moo, and the sickly cows moo. Here a moo, there a moo. You think you get the idea? Suddenly, the scrawny cows ate the healthy cows. What a crazy dream. Pharaoh's second dream was even stranger. There were 7 beautiful heads of grain growing on a stalk. I've never seen grain like that in Egypt. It swayed in the breeze, it smiled at the sun, until 7 shriveled heads of grain appeared. These were blighted, ugly, shriveled heads of grain, and they swallowed up the 7 healthy heads of grain. And the grain stalks don't even have a mouth. Now we're going to listen to Pharaoh interpret the dream.
I am Pharaoh, ruler of all Egypt, worshipped as the sun god Ra. But I have had these strange dreams, and I do not know what they mean. Now, I have sent for you, Joseph, because I have heard from my cupbearer that you have the ability to interpret dreams. I will tell you my dream, and then you shall give me the explanation, for I have heard you have special abilities.
I can't interpret your dream, but God can.
No wonder Pharaoh didn't understand the dream, but God told me what Pharaoh's dream meant. Egypt will have 7 good, happy, healthy years. Then there will be 7 years when no food will grow in Egypt. People will go hungry, so hungry that they will forget about those 7 years. If you were Pharaoh and you heard this was going to happen, what would you do? I told Pharaoh that he should put someone in charge, someone who could store away part of the food grown in the 7 good years. Then the people could eat that during the 7 bad years. Pharaoh liked that idea and he put me in charge. That seemed to happen a lot, doesn't it? So here I am, out of prison, into the palace. Pharaoh's my boss, but I'm in charge other than that. I'm not sure what this new job will be like, but I know that God's given me the ability to do it well. I mean, I keep getting put in charge, so maybe that's a special ability. You know, God has given each of you special abilities too. Even if you think you don't have any abilities. Everyone stand up. Now lean down and without bending your knees, touch your toes. Now show me if you can snap your fingers. Some of you can. Now let's see who can whistle. Some of you could touch your toes, but some couldn't. Some have the ability to snap their fingers or whistle, but some couldn't. God gives each person a special ability, and they all look a little different. Now, I would like for you to talk to your family about this and come together and think of some ideas of things that you do well and how you can help others by doing them. So, I almost forgot. Friends, I'd love to sit and talk with you more, but I have to go start working right away. Please come see me tomorrow. May God bless you.
And good morning. Welcome to Courageous Path to Freedom VBS. This is session number 2. Yesterday we talked about bread making. Today we're talking about breakfast foods. But even though you shouldn't really eat a whole lot of sweets for breakfast, I am in front of the Hall of Temptation. I am taking a cookie.
Good morning. I am Annie Dent, and this is our second day of Vacation Bible School. And today we are going to talk about breakfast. Some of our workers do not have time to get breakfast before they get here. And so usually the bakery brings something special. I have sausage, biscuits, cheese, honey, jelly, several different types of bread. Whatever they would like, that would be wonderful. But then we think about the fact that Jesus served in Matthew 14:13-21. He served barely 5 loaves and 2 fish, and he fed 5,000. And we are praying that these sausage and biscuits will feed 5,000 or more.
They certainly won't survive the day here.
That's it.
And good morning. Welcome to session number 2 of Ancient Health and Beauty. You see me wearing what looks like a kind of a silly little beaded headdress. Sometimes the Egyptian women would wear headdresses like these. I'm going to take it off now and just kind of hold it up and show you. If they were wealthy, they could afford to wear headdresses that would have beads intertwined with some of the string or rope. They would also wear, men and women, sometimes wristbands or armbands. This one is a child-sized armband, so I can only get it up over my wrist. And it would have all kinds of different colors, particularly blue or a turquoise, black and gold. Those were colors that they could make very easily from some of the plants and animals that they had in the area of the Mediterranean, and they could turn those into dyes. In the science station, Mr. Barker talked about how they have the ability to make ink and different dyes out of different plants and different animals. So they would wear the wristbands. They would also wear a lot of jewelry. This is a child-sized wristband. Again, a lot of gold, wherever possible. When the children of Israel were set free after the death angel passed over them and killed the firstborn of the Egyptians let them take whatever spoils they would out of Egypt. And very often that involved a lot of gold, a lot of rings, a lot of bracelets, a lot of necklaces. I've got some beaded necklaces here and some other beaded necklaces here. And the children of Israel carried those out with them. Later on, when we get to the discussion of what happened at Mount Sinai, Moses is going to go up on the mountain, and he's going to be gone for 40 days and 40 nights. And part of what's going to happen while he's gone is that a lot of the Israelites will take their jewelry, particularly the gold, and they will give it up to Aaron, who will fashion an idol, a golden calf. Because Moses has been gone so long that they're a little bit worried about what happened to him, and they don't know if he's coming back, so they revert briefly to their evil ways. Well, of course, when Moses comes down off the mountain, he corrects that. They have to destroy that idol. And later on in their history, when they're told by Moses, these are all the furnishings God wants us to make for a tabernacle, which will be a portable place of worship. We're going to do a special session on the tabernacle in the adult and youth Bible study for VBS when we get to that passage of scripture. And what the women will do at that point is they will all volunteer a lot of their jewelry to give to Moses and Aaron and the craftsmen for them to fashion out the bronze laver. That will be the big dish in front of the tabernacle that they will pour water in so that the priests can wash themselves. Tomorrow we're going to talk a little bit about hygiene that was used, but just for the fun of it, in our Beauty and Bible Times barbershop and beauty salon, one of the biggest hits was we had a barbershop where we used Ready Whip instead of shaving cream, and we would spray some into the children's hands, and they could decide if they wanted to put it on their arm or on their face, and then they would use a plastic knife to learn how to shave it off, because the Egyptians were clean shaven, and very often, as you can see even from my t-shirt hat, even the women shaved their heads very frequently and wore wigs instead because of the hot climate and the fact that it was just much cooler to have a cleanly shaved head. But they had other health type requirements that we're going to talk about when we see you tomorrow in ancient Egypt and the wilderness experience, Courageous VBS. And good morning. Welcome to session number 2 of Courageous Path to Freedom Virtual VBS. Today we're going to be learning about the 12 tribes of Israel. Joseph, yesterday's story, is one of 12 sons born to Jacob. He had 10 older brothers and 1 younger brother. If you'd like to know where in the Bible to find the stories about the 12 sons and who's the oldest, who's in the middle, who's the youngest, Genesis chapters 29 through 36 will give you the story of each of the boys, why their names are what they are. And so today's craft's going to help us do a mobile to help us know who the 12 tribes are. When they go into the land, they're going to be given a piece of land based on tribes, so that every close family, cousins that are close to each other, can stay together. So I'm going to get out of the way and let Doretha take over and explain our mobile.
Okay, our mobile craft for today is the 12 tribes of Israel. The supplies you would need is a hanger. It doesn't matter the size, the color. You need a pair of scissors. You need some yarn or any kind of string. You need some construction paper, and you need markers or 1 marker. Okay, to get started, you will cut out your little squares for your mobile. It can be a circle, square, triangle, it doesn't matter. It's for kids. And then once you cut everything out, there's in the Bible it gives them in order, and that's the way I placed them on the mobile. So we got Reuben, we got Simeon, we got Levi, all the way down to Benjamin. And what you would do is you would get the string, you would tie it to your construction paper, and then you will tie it to the hanger. And so I have one right here. And you'll tie it. And you want to make sure that the strings are different levels. Then you got Joseph. And it doesn't matter the color of the string, the color of the construction paper. You can do it all the same color. It doesn't matter. And you can use tape. That's an option to keep the string so you don't tear it. And then that's what your end result is. And that's your mobile for the 12 tribes of Israel. Any questions?
Yeah. Well, it's not a question as much as it is a comment. Those of you who have been out at our Fort Rucker VBS programs since at least 2004, you know that we've always had the children grouped by tribes, tribe names from Benjamin, Joseph, all the way up to Reuben and Simeon and Issachar. So knowing who's the brothers and knowing why each tribe is named what they are is something important to learn. The Bible will tell you that, and if you get one of our take-home packages, we will have one sheet in there that'll explain why each son is named what he was named. And good morning, welcome to day 3 of Ancient Life. We're going to look a little bit more at some weaving and at some animals, and suggest that one of the games that you'll find on our VBS playlist is a list of games and activities that families can try together at home. Let's talk about this. They would have definitely learned how to braid and weave. You can take some scrap cloth that you've got around the house, get at least 3 different strands, and you weave the cloth together like you would braid a person's hair, and you tie it in the back like we have here, and you can make your own family headbands. That was one of our popular activities at VBS. Boys and girls both like to wear the headbands out on the game field or when they're doing some of the crafts. Very simple, very easy to do. Got here some cloths that show weaving, but it also shows some animals. This one looks like a camel because it's got the single dromedary hump. You'll have camels, some of them will be single hump. That's the kind that was most prevalent in Egypt and along the trade routes to the Holy Land. And then you'll find the double hump camels that are a little more prevalent in other parts of Asia. This weaving includes some sheep out in the woods. And this weaving cloth shows what looks like a donkey. And so people would use the mats to sit on. Sometimes they would use them to weave together blankets for themselves, clothing. Sometimes they would put them for their animals to lay on. Got here a couple of Dollar Tree quality wooden snakes and went into the nursery and pulled out some stuffed animals. There's a game that you can play. If it's a small toy, you can use something like a ring toss type toy like what I have here. If you've got a hula hoop, that's even better. You take your ring, whatever it is, hula hoop, any other kind of round loop that you make for yourself, ring toss, and you tie some string or some yarn to it. You station your stuffed animals out on the floor or on the carport at distances, and you decide where the starting line is, and you can make the starting line closer or further depending upon the age of the person doing the tossing. And you see if you can actually toss and put it over the head of an animal and drag it back to you. So I pulled out this little dog and this little butterfly, ladybug type creature, and what looks like a little donkey, and even Mickey Mouse over here. So there are a lot of fun things you can do to spend time with your families, teaching them about what ancient life was like, what kind of animals would have been in Bible times. A lot of it you can look on your computer and guess for yourself, but we're also putting up on our playlist a list of fun games and activities and things to try. One in particular, I'll just go ahead and mention it right here. It's a takeoff on the game Duck, Duck, Goose, only instead of Duck, Duck, Goose, it's Pharaoh, Pharaoh, Brains. And what you do is you get something that resembles brains. We're going to talk about brains in our next session, which will be on the embalmer shop. The ancient Egyptians had a practice of embalming, and they would remove some of the vital organs, including the brains, from the deceased persons before they mummified them. And so you can use a lot of different things. You could use cooked spaghetti noodles in a bag, in a plastic bag, Ziploc type bag, or you could use yarn, or you could use Play-Doh, almost anything that's soft and squishy. A bean bag would even do. And the person who is it goes around and they're touching the heads of all the participants. And when they touch somebody's head and they say brains, they drop the bag of the brains, and they have to run around the circle and try to get seated. The person whose head has been tapped has to get up, and before they can chase the person around, they have to grab the brains. If they get to the person before they're able to sit down, then the person who's been hit on the head with the tap can sit back down. If not, they're it, and they'll go around, and so you can play a version of Duck, Duck, Goose with a little bit of Egyptian flavor for it. Use your imagination. There are a lot of fun things you can do. One of the stories that we're probably going to do in music and drama, which is about to be taped next week, we did this at the chapel a lot for fall festivals. We would get some blue paper and put it on the floor, and that represented the Nile River, and we'd get a whole bunch of either the wood or the little plastic reptiles and station them throughout, and we would tell the story of baby Moses. We even would take some coloring pages of crocodiles, let the younger kids color them, and they got to pretend to be crocodiles, and we would float the basket by moving it along on the floor, and Miriam would watch it, and the crocodiles would try to come and get her, and she would push them back with a stick. So you can make games that'll enhance the VBS experience for your children. Use your imagination. Have fun with it. Where we're at the embalmer's shop. For this one, you might be able to find some of the props and things that you would need in the toy section of a store, at a costuming shop. If you don't do it now or can't find the things now, then the closer it gets to the fall, when the Halloween costumes and decorations come out, you can pick some up then to use over and over again, either in your home or in church settings. That's where I got some of these. I went to a costume and prop shop that happens to be here in the Dothan area to pick up the big skeleton that I've got here. You might also find them in places like Hobby Lobby, where they have science and anatomy type shops. And I got this as like a Halloween type decoration. These came with our VBS kits, but you can look for costumes that have jewelry. The Egyptians realized that the serpent was a powerful animal, that there were a lot of poisonous serpents in the area of Egypt, but also that they could be used for medicines in certain quantities. So they made a lot of jewelry with symbols of snakes on them. And they made medicines using a variety of herbs and spices and things like animals that they could use to make medicines. When someone died, if they were an ordinary person, they would just be wrapped and put in the ground. But the more rich, the more famous you were, if you were Pharaoh or somebody powerful in his government or somebody that had a lot of money, you could go through a process of mummification. A lot of the archaeology digs in the late 19th, early 20th century, and even into our time, are uncovering cemeteries with bones. About 4 years ago, a lady from our chapel whose daughter was part of our youth group for a while, she was now a college student, and she went on an archaeology dig to Ashkelon, Israel, and helped uncover a Philistine cemetery. And the work that they did on their archaeology dig for Troy University, just a few miles here from Fort Rucker, made a cover story in Biblical Archaeology magazine. And so when my copy came out, I gave it to my friend because her daughter was one of the people featured in that magazine. So the study of archaeology would be something that would be very important for people to know about in our day and time. It gives us a lot of details on how the ancient peoples lived, what they ate, how they died, some of the processes that they were used to involve burying someone. Over here on the wall, we have the lid to our sarcophagus. A few years ago at VBS, we had somebody make a sarcophagus for us. I know you can see it on the film, but I'm going to bring it just a little bit closer here to make sure that you can see a little bit better detail. I nicknamed this Pharaoh Alphonse after Al, the man who actually put the coffin together for me, because we went and we got a fake mummy to put in the sarcophagus, and we had it available at VBS when kids could come by and they could look in, they could take turns toting the coffin to the pyramid for its resting place. If you were rich, you would have a fancy casket called a sarcophagus, and it would have a carving with your name on it. They would make a mask of your face. Why? Because the Egyptians believed in an afterlife. They knew that death wasn't the end of the story. They didn't believe, like Joseph and Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Christians believe, that God raises us from the dead and that if we believe in him, we go to heaven. But the Egyptians had an idea of the afterlife, and so they wanted to make sure that when they died, if they had a lot of money, that their bodies were well preserved, because they thought they were going to get the same bodies in the afterlife. And they also wanted to make sure that a lot of the things that were important to them, their favorite toys, their favorite outfits to wear, their jewelry, would be put in the tomb, the pyramid tombs with them, so that they could have use of things in the afterlife. So even if you don't have access to something like this to practice on, to wrap up with gauze, everybody's got this object these days. In fact, everybody hangs on to these now, but you can also use toilet paper not only for its intended purpose, but it makes a great way to have fun as a family, taking turns wrapping people up as a mummy. You could wrap the whole body. If you want to conserve your paper, you could just decide to wrap the face and maybe the arms and tuck it in, and you could have even contests to see which family member can make the best looking mummy. If you don't want to use live people, do you have any dolls laying around? Let the children take turns wrapping dolls, see who can do it the fastest, see who can make the best looking mummy. Lots of fun with just simple rolls of toilet paper. We'll see you next time.